All right. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Everyone can take your seats. Thank you so much for coming. Happy New Year to everyone. Welcome to Science on Tap Minocqua. My name is Susan Knight. I work at the University of Wisconsin Trout Lake Station, just up the road. And Science on Tap is an example of the Wisconsin idea, the idea that the boundaries of the university are the borders of the state. And our partners in Science on Tap Minocqua are UW Trout Lake Station, UW Kemp Natural Resources Station, the Minocqua Public Library, and WXPR, and the Lakeland Badger chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and our hosts here, Oak Fire Pizzeria. We thank everybody for their participation. We are funded by a grant from the Brittingham Fund to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Just a reminder that there are 3 ways to watch. Obviously, you can come here and watch in person. You can always watch live at home, and you can also watch archived editions just by going to our website and clicking on Watch Archived Events. So hopefully you can all do that. Our next speakers, next month in February, we're very excited to have our own Gretchen Garish, the director at UW Trout Lake Station, and our own Scott Bovey from Kemp Natural Resources Station. And they're going to be speaking of UW up north, what's happening at Kemp Natural Resources Station and Trout Lake Station. And that'll be on February 2nd. Next month, 2023. So I hope you can all come and find out what's going on at these field stations right in our own neighborhood. But tonight, we have Bob Martini. Bob grew up in Marinette County, which he reports has more trout streams than any other county in Wisconsin. He was influenced by his dad, who had a fine 35-year career in the Wisconsin DNR, which started when he graduated from the first environmental education major in America in what is now UW Stevens Point, 1946 to 1950. Bob has been hooked on rivers and lakes since 1969 and 70, when he worked on the Pike River Trout Inventory Project and later attended the first Earth Day while at Northwestern University. Bob has a BS in zoology from UW Milwaukee and did graduate work in microbiology there. Bob himself is now retired from the Wisconsin DNR. He spent his career working on water quality issues in Wisconsin for 50 years, 32 with the DNR as statewide rivers protection coordinator, and over 150 years, doesn't even look that old, service on a dozen education and environmental organizations, including Wisconsin's Green Fire, and I'll bet he might talk a little bit about that. We have Green Fire information at the back of the room that you can pick up on your way out, or if you didn't see it already. And on the Oneida County Lakes and Rivers Association. But this accounting of Bob's history doesn't come close to conveying how hard he worked with and against politicians, business owners, and community members. As Bob often says, first they say it isn't a problem, then they say, well, maybe it's a problem, but it isn't our fault. And then they say, well, maybe it is our fault, but we can't do anything about it. And then they say, well, maybe we could do something about it, but it'll be too expensive. And finally they do something, and and everybody is better off. So in 2014, Bob received a Career Achievement Award from the North American River Management Society for a lifetime of work that he says just seemed like fun. Okay, so here's your trivia question about Bob. When Bob's son was in kindergarten, Bob brought home a very large hornet's nest for his son to display at his next show and tell. His wife was concerned that it might contain live hornets, but Bob reassured her and said, oh, it's late October. Don't worry, we've had a couple of frosts and absolutely no chance that there are any living hornets left in that nest. So it went into his wife's car, and she parked the car and went into work. She was a teacher, and the car got kind of hot because it was a hot day. After all day teaching, she opened the car door to find hundreds of angry hornets. What did Bob's wife say after the incident? Answer A, oh, don't worry, Bob. I only got stung 6 times. Answer B, don't worry, Bob. The stings might help me with my arthritis, if I ever develop arthritis. Or C, okay, Mr. Hotshot, DNR biologist, I guess you don't know everything. Right, here's Bob.
Well, that certainly is the truth. I don't know everything. But I do know that the Clean Water Act worked in Wisconsin. This is the 50th anniversary of Clean Water Act this year, or last October. It came out of frustration and anger all over America because everyone had an example of a terrible water quality problem in their own backyard. We all heard about the Cuyahoga River burning. Well, it burned a whole bunch of times, and there's rivers in Wisconsin that burned also. Everybody had an experience that led them to believe that clean water was really important and it had to be restored. So it became a political reality, and the Clean Water Act was passed by an overwhelming majority. President Nixon vetoed it, the first major myth involved in the Clean Water Act. He said that the Clean Water Act was too expensive, it would stop industrial growth, it would stop development, and therefore it should not happen, so he vetoed it. 2 hours later, the Senate and the House overrode his veto by a vote of 243 to 23 in the House, and 57 to 12 in the Senate, overwhelmingly overrode the president's veto to put the Clean Water Act into effect. It was a political necessity because people were fed up with the conditions that they were experiencing all over America. So in 50 years, we've got a lot of background information. We've got a lot of information to tell us whether or not it worked, whether or not the myths are correct, or whether the scientific and historical reality is correct. So I'd like to go over a few of the projects that I worked on in this area, Wisconsin River Basin, that demonstrate how the Clean Water Act worked. And really, it's important to understand that because the myths are still alive. The myths are still out there. People are still saying it's too expensive to have clean water. They're saying that it will adversely affect business and jobs. Well, let's take a look at that. These 4 projects that I would like to talk about are the cleanup of the Wisconsin River, aldicarb in the Central Sands, the acid rain issue, and finally dams all over the state of Wisconsin. The Wisconsin River in 1976 was in terrible shape. Imagine you're sitting on the dike at Hat Rapids Flowage below Rhinelander. You're looking out over the flowage, and all you see is brown. It's not blue water. The whole flowage was covered with slime and sludge. The sludge then dried into a crust, and small animals could run right across the flowage. And that's how bad it was. There was so much sludge that the hydro turbine in that dam was inefficient. They couldn't get their full efficiency out of it because the sludge was gumming up the system. They had a skimmer log across the flowage that collected this sludge on the surface, pumped it over a hill, and put it into an unlined pit, which eventually contaminated groundwater. It was all bad. And the idea was that you shouldn't try to clean up a river, you should try to prevent the sludge from getting in the river in the first place. We had 3 40-mile segments of the Wisconsin River that went to zero dissolved oxygen every year, summer and winter. Fish can't survive under those conditions. The fish had tumors all over them, the ones that could survive, that came in from the tributaries. Clearly an unacceptable situation. So we decided we should calculate exactly how much waste could go into the river. We used a computer model, which was very new at that time, to calculate exactly how much the paper mills and municipalities could put into the river and still maintain enough dissolved oxygen so fish and aquatic life could survive in the river. That was the goal, survival of fish and aquatic life. Well, you would have thought we were advocating burning the American flag in the square of the cities in the Wisconsin River Valley. There was uniform opposition to this idea. They said it was too expensive, just like Nixon said. They said that jobs would be driven away from the state, the paper industry would fall apart, it would go to states like Alabama where they didn't have strong regulations, and that the whole economy of the Wisconsin River Valley would collapse. Well, we decided, well, let's use science instead. I mean, this was a myth that was out there. Let's try to disprove it with science. We set up a system that cut back the paper mills by 93%. The municipalities were also cut back substantially. No jobs were lost. No paper mills went out of business. There wasn't a single lawsuit that was filed against this restriction. No companies moved to Alabama. And we were still the #1 paper manufacturing state in the Union. Clearly, there was something that was right about that system. When we asked the technical directors of the paper mills after this was all finished, did it really adversely affect you? Most of them said it really benefited the paper industry because it forced us to look at our use of water, energy, and fiber, which are 3 really important factors in the paper industry. It made us modernize all those systems. It made us more competitive with the mills in southern United States, which were newer and had competitive advantages in pricing. So they said, on balance, the paper industry benefited from this. It was just the opposite of what the myth prescribed. The second example is aldicarb in the Central Sands. The Central Sands grows a lot of potatoes. The manufacturer of aldicarb, which is a systemic insecticide, said that you couldn't grow potatoes. You couldn't be profitable as a potato grower unless you removed all of the Colorado potato beetles from every plant you grow. And therefore, you have to use our product, aldicarb, to kill all those potato beetles. It isn't possible to do this without our product. And people in Central Sand said, well, this is an important industry. We can't afford to live without it. How can we possibly do this? Our own DNR said that the aldicarb couldn't get to the groundwater because it's insoluble in water, when in fact we had been working with UW-Stevens Point and found 7 pesticides had moved through the soil into the groundwater. In some cases, individual growers were putting aldicarb on their fields and drinking their own aldicarb. So we went to the University of Wisconsin Extension and said, how many Colorado potato beetles can you have on a plant before you go out of business? They did a whole study, determined it isn't 0, it's 7 or 8 Colorado potato beetles. You don't need aldicarb. You can still be profitable using some other pesticide management systems and avoid aldicarb. What happened then was that the pesticide was extremely expensive and you had to apply it to the field, and therefore they actually had a greater profit margin per acre after abandoning the pesticide than they had while they were using it. The groundwater was protected, the economy was protected, and the citizens' right to clean water was protected at the same time that the local economy in the Central Sands was not adversely affected. The third example is acid rain. We were told back in the 70s that acid rain is not a Wisconsin problem. In fact, DNR wouldn't even work on it. They wouldn't let us send our samples to the State Laboratory of Hygiene. They told us it was New York's problem or Ohio's problem. Well, we went out and instead of using that myth, we went to the science, analyzed the rainfall and the snowfall, and we determined that the rainfall in northern Wisconsin was 10 to 100 times as acid as normal rainfall should have been. We then looked at lakes, sampled thousands of lakes in northern Wisconsin, found out about 2,000 of those lakes are susceptible to acidification if the rainfall continues at that acid level. We of course, made this into a big public issue, went to the press and did all kinds of descriptions, and people said the same thing. You cannot control acid rain because it would be too expensive, it would drive businesses out of the state, the kilowatt cost would be so high that businesses would move out of the state. People couldn't afford their own electric bills because kilowatt prices were so high. Well, we again turned back to the science to dispel that myth. We decided that it was really too expensive to use scrubbers to pull that sulfur dioxide out of the atmosphere. Those were millions of dollars per power plant. Instead, we told the utilities, go to the west and get low sulfur coal contracts. Low sulfur coal would take care of the problem. Nobody wanted it at the time because it was a little more expensive and transportation was a problem. So the utilities, as a result of a state law, went out to Wyoming and locked in 30-year low sulfur coal contracts at a low price. 3 or 4 years later, the federal government passed almost the exact same acid rain control law as Wisconsin passed. And then everybody wanted low sulfur coal. The price skyrocketed. What happened was, in Wisconsin for 10 to 20 years, we had some of the lowest kilowatt prices in the Midwest, some of the lowest in the country, because we locked in those low sulfur coal prices at a time when the price was low. And at the same time, we avoided acidification of these lakes. We had about a dozen of them that were already becoming acidified. They went back to normal. We protected the public's right to water. We protected the ability of the tourism industry to take advantage of these lakes and rivers in northern Wisconsin, and at the same time ended up with low costs per kilowatt. Everybody benefited. The triumph of science over myth. The fourth example is dams in the state. We have lots of dams in the state, 3,800 to be exact. About 130 of them produce electric power. And that's great because you're producing electric power without the combustion of fossil fuels. So that concept is really good. But in the process of doing that, there are lots of impacts on lakes and rivers resulting from those dams. The dissolved oxygen is affected because the temperature of the water is changed. The fish and aquatic life can't move up and downstream to habitats they need during the year because of these dams. We have a whole series of fish and wildlife and safety problems resulting from the dams. We suggested that some of these dams ought to have changes in their federal licenses so that the public rights would be protected. Boat landings, fishing piers, all sorts of fish and wildlife and endangered resources protections were proposed. The companies said, hey, we can't operate under those conditions. They're too expensive. We couldn't possibly spend all that money to provide these public amenities to the public who owns the water in exchange for a license to produce electric power. The licenses were implemented. The dams are all still there. None of the dams were removed as threatened by the utilities. And the public's right to water was protected, the environment was protected, and the economy continues to benefit from power being generated without the combustion of fossil fuels. Everybody benefited. So you see a pattern here. The triumph of science, scientific data, using regulation based on science instead of myth. The myth comes in from misconceptions and basically the political system. If you use the political system to solve a problem, it's not going to be as good as using science and data and logic and sound business decision making. That's what these issues on the Wisconsin River and in this part of the state proved. The one example of a failure of the Clean Water Act is non-point source pollution. The Clean Water Act does not affect or regulate non-point source pollution, and therefore all of the voluntary efforts that have been tried, including millions of dollars of incentive payments to agriculture, have not decreased nutrients going into lakes and streams at all. In fact, they've increased. Algae in lakes and streams in Wisconsin is the single largest water quality problem we have right now for surface waters. And it's because these nutrients are being put into the water without any regulation at all. The same arguments are made. Agriculture cannot prosper with regulation. It's impossible. It's too expensive. And yet, no regulation has been incurred by the legislature. No regulation has been passed. And it's the one area of water quality that has not improved as a result of the Clean Water Act because it doesn't cover it. All the other ones have been taken care of. So the paper industry, for instance, says, hey, we spent $300 million cleaning up the Wisconsin River because of our paper mills. The agriculture community didn't spend anything. They don't have to do anything to improve water quality. And in fact, it is the number one water quality problem in Wisconsin right now. So it proves that regulation properly based on science can accomplish these goals, and lack of regulation without any incentive to improve agriculture has done just the opposite. Well, there's good regulation, there's bad regulation. And what we found out was that if you do it properly based on science and data and logic and sound business decision making, and making sure that you have a goal, making sure you use adaptive management, come back year after year and make the regulation more efficient so it has a minimum impact on the regulated community. You have to involve the regulated community in the technology of developing the regulation so you're sure that it can be done. You have to make sure that there is a technology forcing pattern there so that if the technology doesn't exist to clean up the water, that a new industry will develop, which is exactly what happened with the paper industry. There was no technology to get to our goals when we started, but a new industry sprung up, and it's a lucrative industry that is out there today to clean up wastewater. Everybody benefited from the proper development of regulation without adverse impact. So what I'd like to say is that the Clean Water Act was extremely successful, but it was a success of the scientific process, the scientific regulation based on scientific principles, data, and logic. I think it's really important for the public to understand this because we have a whole series of things that are in that same category. Climate change, for example, has the same arguments against it. It's too expensive. Technology doesn't exist. It's impossible for one little person or one little state or one little city to have any impact on the whole world. It's not true. You can come up with a system using those basic principles to address climate change just like we addressed acid rain, which was an interstate, international problem, just the same kind of situation. So we can learn from this experience, and if we overcome myth with science, we can probably take care of most of the problems that face us in the environment today. So that's my story. Questions?
All right, thanks. Carol will be wandering around with a microphone.
Hi. How do the so-called forever chemicals fit in with the Clean Water Act?
Well, the Clean Water Act wasn't really designed to take care of drinking water problems. There's a separate law for Safe Drinking Water Act for those compounds. It also wasn't very well designed to take care of microcontaminants. There are microcontaminants all over the place, and we found a lot of them in the Wisconsin River. Arsenic and mercury and dioxin and furans and PCBs were all in the Wisconsin River. But there was no mechanism in the Clean Water Act to take care of that. Just as there's a poor mechanism for most of these forever chemicals, the first thing you have to do is set a standard. We haven't even been able to agree on a standard, either a federal standard or a state standard, for most of these forever chemicals. Until you have a standard, you can't back calculate a scientific system to achieve the standard because you don't know what the goal is. So you have a lot of people saying it's no problem because the standard is so high, and others are saying, well, it is a problem, you just don't have the correct standard. So it's clearly a gap in that system. There needs to be better standards, better systems set up to accommodate these microcontaminants. And there are thousands of them being introduced in the industrial world every year worldwide. Most of them are not tested at all for federal or for human or animal toxicity before they're released into use. Some of them don't even have information. It's proprietary information that isn't communicated to the regulating community. So there are a lot of gaps in that area that the Clean Water Act did not address.
Based on your experience, would we as a society be better off if they were controlled at the state level or the federal level?
In general, I think most regulation is most effective if you can do it as local as possible. If you can set a goal for an individual body of water and design a system to meet that, that's always the most efficient way to do it. On the other hand, if you don't have federal umbrella regulations, you end up with states competing with each other, setting lower standards in order to try to attract industry, for example. That was one of the things that we found out about the Clean Water Act. If you didn't have uniform goals through the entire United States, you might have states that say, we don't have any state rules, come to our state. And you want to avoid that if possible. So it's important to have it at both levels. The local level is really important as well, especially for monitoring and especially for gathering information about individual bodies of water.
So I have two questions. One is, we have a friend who is Dr. Laux' son. Did you work with Dr. Laux?
Ori Laux, yes.
Yeah, okay, great, I'll have to tell him. And
He
then the other-
gave us a lot of help on the acid rain program.
Yeah.
And he's also a great contributor to the Northwoods Land Trust.
Well, I have to remember that. I'll talk to Eric about that. With respect to climate change, I worked at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Climate change is real. It's very real. It's scary real. One thing that I heard on NPR that was of extreme interest to me was that the reference data that a lot of politicians had used to refute climate change, the author of the study actually, and I can't remember his name, came forward and said, I screwed up. My analysis was wrong. But you don't ever hear that. You only ever hear, it's not real, or yeah, it's really bad. And I also worked at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, and I have friends who are involved in measuring carbon dioxide. And climate change is real, and it is accelerating at an alarming pace. So are you aware of this study that was produced? I can't
Well,
remember the name of the gentleman.
One of the advantages of the scientific system is you get confirmation. One of the basic principles is you try to get replication of most of the studies in order to see if they are valid. Sometimes they aren't. Sometimes you get more information from the replication studies than you got from the original study. So it's important, if you're using science-based management, to continue to look at the advances in research and development to try to make sure that your information is most up to date. And that's the principle of adaptive management. You set a regulation, you come back a year or two later and say what's working, what isn't working, abandon the stuff that isn't working, accelerate the stuff that is working. Over time, then, you make it more and more efficient. You make the regulation more and more efficient, more protection for the environment at less cost. So that principle has to continue. You don't just start out with a regulation and continue with it forever and keep making the same mistakes over and over again. Same principle.
Question back here, Bob?
Yeah, I noticed that we've had a lot of issues with microplastics in the waters in the Great Lakes, so much so that they were finding evidence of microplastics in beer made in Duluth. What kind of regulations do we have in place to protect the Wisconsin River from microplastics, and what kind of a threat do you think that poses for ecosystems?
Well, I think microplastics are everywhere. Antarctica, they're in our lungs, they're all over the place. And I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. There are no regulations that I know of under the Clean Water Act to protect a body of water like the Wisconsin River. Those plastics go in for a variety of sources. There used to be snow dumps on every city in the Wisconsin River where they'd push the snow into the river. All of the debris that accumulated on city streets throughout the entire river was pushed into the Wisconsin River, including all plastics. Bags from blowing in the wind from stores are all over the place. There is nothing in the Clean Water Act that protects against that kind of contaminant. That's one of the flaws of the Clean Water Act.
Question here?
So,
It's okay, hold it close, they'll adjust.
you were talking about non-point sources. Is there any opportunity with something like the Clean Water Act to amend it in the future to take into account things like non-point sources, things like maybe road salts, for instance, that sort of thing?
One of the first meetings I went to on water quality back in 1976, they brought up that same question about amending the Clean Water Act and amending Wisconsin statutes to take care of non-point source pollution. The thought at the time was, we'll take care of point source pollution first. That's the most costly thing. We'll get that taken care of. Then we'll move on non-point source pollution. And because the success is there will be political momentum at the state and federal level to control non-point source pollution. It never happened. What happened instead was a series of incentive programs giving farmers money to try to get them to implement the practices that were necessary to prevent nutrients from flowing into streams. In the Wisconsin River Basin, for instance, the old plain flowage had over $1 million worth of incentives implemented over a 10-year period to try to reduce nutrients going into the old plain flowage. The old plain flowage had fish kills almost every year. Even the carp were killed almost every year. It went to zero dissolved oxygen because of excessive algae growth resulting from those nutrients. There was at least 6 feet of dead settled algae by the dam at the old plain flowage that was flushed out into the Wisconsin River every single year. But there was no mechanism at all other than voluntary and incentive programs to control the nutrients that were causing that problem. There still isn't today. In fact, today they're talking about an incentive program in order to pay for performance. Give farmers incentives, voluntary monetary incentives to perform those practices that are going to reduce nutrients from flowing into the water. As far as I know, there is absolutely no political appetite at the state or federal level to amend the Clean Water Act or state statutes to control agricultural sources of non-point source pollution. It's one of the great myths of water quality. There is no way that you can politically do this. At least that's the myth. But those myths have been dispelled for 50 years in every other system. So it seems to me that an attempt would be in order, at least, especially in view of the fact that all the other industries have spent so many millions of dollars meeting the goals of the Clean Water Act.
We have a couple of online questions. The first one is, what has happened to mercury contamination of surface waters since the passage of Clean Water Act, and what can be done to decrease these mercury levels today?
Well, the Clean Water Act didn't really impact mercury levels in water. That was mostly an air pollution issue. During the acid rain debates, mercury was a major issue. In fact, there was an attempt to try to find coal that was low in mercury, just like the coal that was low in sulfur, to try to reduce mercury levels. Mercury comes into a lot of water bodies from the atmosphere in many cases. We on the Wisconsin River, however, had several point source discharges of mercury, especially paper mills and Nakusa, for instance. Those were all contained with point source discharge restrictions under the Clean Water Act, but the majority of the atmospheric mercury is not controlled. There were air pollution regulations a few years ago that reduced some of those sources, but there still is an active source of mercury. It's difficult to get at that issue because so much of it comes from diffuse sources in the atmosphere. So the point sources have been taken care of. The atmospheric sources have been attempted. There's been a reduction, but there still is mercury coming in from the atmosphere to just about every surface water in the nation.
Another online, and raise your hand if you have one here in person. Do you have any data to quantify the water quality and fishery improvements in the Wisconsin River from before the reduction required by the Clean Water Act and after they were implemented?
When I started in 1976, the paper mills were putting in about 425,000 pounds of biochemical oxygen demand in the river every day. After the 93% reduction, that dropped to under 30,000 pounds. That's for 15 pulp and paper mills on the Wisconsin River. The municipalities routinely were putting significant amounts of waste into the river because many of them didn't have even secondary treatment. Now they have tertiary treatment. In some cases, municipalities have dropped their biochemical oxygen demand waste down to a level that's extremely low, 3, 4, 5 parts per million, where they were at 50, 60, 70 parts per million. Phosphorus reductions from the paper industry have been dramatic. There were some paper mills that were putting in 12, 15 parts per million phosphorus into the river with 8 million gallons per day of discharge. Now, those are all less than 1 part per million. So there's been significant point source reductions across the board for oxygen demanding wastes and for phosphorus. Some of these microcontaminants, however, have not been adequately addressed. So there's a lot of statistical analysis that shows a dramatic reduction in the pollutants that are covered by the Clean Water Act, but that does not include all of those microcontaminants that Clean Water Act does not do a very good job containing.
Okay, great program, Bob. Thanks for your service and helping clean up the Wisconsin River. I grew up in Wausau, I grew up on the river, and I think people would be interested in hearing a story about George Meade's granddaughter and how she contributed to cleaning up the river.
George Meade was the undisputed leader of the paper industry in the Wisconsin River Valley. His family went back 3 or 4 generations of paper making all over the country, really. He had the largest paper making operation on the river. When he finally sold his company for $7 billion, it was one of the healthiest companies. I asked George Meade to talk about his progression on how he thought about controlling pollution, because it was expensive. He had the largest mill on the river and the greatest cost for controlling pollution. He told me that, a little background first. At our first meeting in Stevens Point, 1976, George Meade got up in front of everybody in the whole room, all the press, all the paper mills, the DNR, and he held up a beaker of liquid and he said, "This is my final effluent from my treatment plant at my paper mill." And he drank it right down. He said, "If it's good enough for me, it's good enough for the Wisconsin River. We're not going to do anything further." 1 year later, after he looked at the science, after his outstanding technical director gave him the background information, he came back and decided for his company that he would have the best wastewater treatment plant on the river. And I asked him years later, I said, why did you do that, George? You went from 180 degrees in your position on this issue. And he said, well, there's 3 reasons. First of all, it was good for my company. He said, the paper industry fluctuates wildly in price and demand. He said, if you aren't producing maximum quantities when the price is high, your company is not going to be sustainable. When the price drops off, all you can barely do is keep the lights on and keep your people employed. You make your money on that top end of that curve. If you have to shut your mill down or reduce production because of wastewater discharge waste load allocations in your permit, then you lose that sustainability. That's the first reason. Second reason is that the people in Wisconsin Rapids deserve to have a functioning paper industry. It was our job, our responsibility to make sure all these jobs are sustained. We wanted to make sure that our mill was sustainable and for the community, for all the people that work here. The third reason was that his little granddaughter came to him one time and said, I don't want to visit you because it smells bad. He lived on an island in the Wisconsin River, and it really did smell bad. And he said, that got to me. He said, it was not a good thing. So he made all the right decisions for all the right reasons. His company benefited, the community benefited, and he had a personal reason for doing these things. And I think it's an example of how one person can make a big difference. He was the leader of the industry in the valley. Once he decided to do that, everybody else said, well, geez, how can we argue that it's too expensive or there's no technology or we're not going to do it? When he's the biggest mill on the river and he's doing better than Wisconsin DNR required. He told his design engineers, I want you to make sure that our mills produce only half of what DNR regulations require. Half of what they require. And then later on, when we restricted the amount of phosphorus going out from the paper mills, he also said, I want to make sure we go way below the 1 part per million limit that DNR requires. And the rest of the mills on the river came to several of our meetings and said, there's no technology to do this. It's impossible. It's too expensive, the usual. And he got up with his technical director and he said, we're doing half of what DNR asked for. You guys can do the same thing. How can you argue with that? I mean, he was the leader. He was the biggest mill on the river. It shows how one person can change the attitudes of a whole valley full of industry people.
We have a very active online audience tonight, so I have a few more questions from there. What about nitrates in the groundwater in the central sands? Is there any plan that would not cripple the agribusiness in central Wisconsin?
Well, when we did pesticide analysis in the central sands, we also did nitrate analysis and found lots of wells, drinking water wells that had high nitrates. And a lot of it was directly attributable to irrigated agriculture because you had porous soils, a lot of water for irrigation, and annual applications of nitrogen on those same soils. So some of that nitrogen was moving beyond the root zone down into groundwater before the plants could take it up and incorporate it into the plants. We highlighted that issue by trying to explain how many wells are high in nitrates. Obviously, the health department in the state of Wisconsin provided all the background information on why nitrates are bad for every person who's drinking high nitrate water. But there really isn't any mechanism now statewide to reduce the nitrates in the groundwater. They've been talking about this for years. There are many parts of the state, karst regions, for instance, where nitrates are really bad, where in some cases the water that you get out of your tap is brown because of the karst regions, the way it moves in the groundwater and geochemical system. But there really is no effective mechanism for regulating that system because it would require legislation. Why isn't there a legislation? Obviously, there's an interest. There's just as much interest now in protecting groundwater as there was back in 1972 when people demanded clean water. The problem is the political system is not set up to do that sort of thing. It's not like it was in the 70s where people got together and tried to solve problems for society. It's not that way anymore. There are dozens of processes in the state of Wisconsin related to regulation and environment that have been weakened or eliminated over the past 15 years. Wisconsin Green Fire has a great paper. In fact, our fine president is right over there, has some copies if you want a copy. Or you can go online at Wisconsin Green Fire and read this report. Read how the system has been changed so dramatically that you can't get effective regulation anymore. You can't get a system passed through the legislature that would allow you to use the scientific process to come up with the best system to take care of the problem. It has really adversely affected the ability of any regulatory agency to protect the public's rights in the water and to protect the quality of the water. So if you read that report, I think you'll understand why it's difficult to get PFAS and forever chemicals and non-point source pollution and manure in the water, all those problems that are unregulated into a regulated system.
I've got to pick from a few questions, actually. So, first question, what defines a non-point source contaminant? And the second question, if you were dictator of the world, how would you solve these problems?
Well, I'd love to be dictator of the world. How do you get to be that? Non-point source pollution is anything that doesn't come out of a pipe, basically. I mean, that isn't the technical definition, but it's runoff from fields in a diffuse manner. So you might have a 160-acre field with water running off the whole field into a ditch or into a river or a lake or something. Whereas a paper mill might have an actual pipe where all their waste comes right out of one pipe. That's a point source. All the others are non-point sources. There are atmospheric non-point sources as well as terrestrial. In dictator of the world, basically I'd like to see us go back 50 years to the kind of legislature we had then, the kind of Congress we had then. Because at that time, if you talk to a person like Gaylord Nelson, which I did many times, he said that they would argue like crazy in session in the legislature, and then they'd go out for a beer at night and they work out a system, come back the next day, and everybody passed it. It wasn't hunky-dory, but it was a system that allowed you to at least make progress on some of these main issues, especially if there were issues that a majority of the citizens cared about. Right now, there's no mechanism to do that. You can't get the first base on an agricultural non-point source regulation passing. And I think to understand that, read that report by Green Fire. It explains exactly why that's a problem. So if I could change one thing, I'd say let's go back in our political system to the way it was decades ago when both sides of the aisle worked on trying to correct the problem.
So just help Bob out a little bit here. There is also, we're partnering with the League of Women Voters, January 15th, coming up here shortly on this system that doesn't work, the regulatory system that no longer works. I still call it the broken rules. It has a new name, but it's January 15th. You go to the League site or the Green Fire site, you can register and watch the webinar. It's going to be really good. Couple other things, there's a great PFAS paper on our website that will go into detail about the forever chemicals. And they're in this regulatory cycle where it's so difficult to adopt regulations. It takes 3 years to adopt a standard. Then if you don't succeed in that 3-year time period, I call it chutes and ladders. You go right down to the bottom and you start over another 3-year process. So to get a PFAS standard for groundwaters is going to take us at least 6 years. Meantime, we know the health impacts of it. So it's a really important issue. Last thing I wanted to say about mercury was that we're really dealing with a lot of legacy contamination that's in our water bodies. When they closed the mine at White Pine, that reduced half of the mercury. Processing sulfide ore releases a ton of mercury, and when they closed that, that reduced the amount of mercury emissions in the Great Lakes watershed by half.
Kind of mine.
Sulfide mining, copper, lead, zinc. We do not have any minerals in this state that could be used for electronic batteries like lithium. Most of our minerals are copper, and that is not really an item for electronic batteries for cars.
Tom, that event with the league is January 10th.
January 10th for the webinar.
Thank you for doing this and the UW Extension. This is absolutely fantastic that you guys are putting together this kind of information. I hear that the online attendance is pretty good too, which is pretty cool. I've got a kind of a two-part. One is we've got rivers in Wisconsin that flow north into the Great Lakes. Are we doing anything with that? And then the other question is, what about the other states south of us along the Mississippi where, we've done our, busted our butt to get Wisconsin good, but what's happening after that?
Well, there is no free lunch, obviously. If you pollute the tributary streams, the lower part of the receiving river is going to have a problem. And one of the things we found in the past was a lot of these dams, there's 26 dams on the Wisconsin River, they were all full of sediment. And after the waste reduction occurred, we still had to do something with all that sediment. What happened was the hydrologic system moved it all out into the Gulf of Mexico, and now we got this big dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico the size of Connecticut, because everybody else was doing the same thing. They were trying to reduce the amount of waste going into the river, but the stuff that was already there, as Tom mentioned, the legacy stuff, moved out down through the system. And it's really important to understand what happens to that waste from cradle to grave in order to plan these systems. The streams that are flowing in both directions are all subject to the Clean Water Act. Some of them have restrictions in the receiving water, like the Great Lakes has some requirements to try to reduce some of those areas of concern, they're called, that have contaminated zones on tributaries to the Great Lakes system. Some of those go a little further than the rest of the inland waters that are restricted in the state of Wisconsin. But they're all subject to the Clean Water Act except for non-point source pollution. So what happens when climate changes? In the northern part of the state, we get more rainfall. That means in some cases, really large episodic storms as well. Instead of having a half an inch or quarter inch every few days, we get 6 inches every 6 weeks. And that creates serious problems that were not envisioned when the Clean Water Act was passed and are not covered by the Clean Water Act. If you look at some of the washouts in northern Wisconsin that went directly into Lake Superior, they're huge. I mean, the roads and culverts and bridges just totally washed out. This sort of thing is going to happen more often in the future because of climate change, and the system has not been developed to take advantage of it or to prevent it. For example, in the state of Wisconsin, we have an administrative code that says that local municipalities cannot put in Cadillac systems for bridges and storm infrastructure. They didn't want them to spend excessive amount of money. They wanted to spend the minimum. So they set a database that engineers have to use for calculating the size of storms and the frequency of storms so you could design your bridges and culverts. Well, that database is from pre-1950. It doesn't take into account the additional rainfall and additional water that now has to be incorporated into an engineering design to prevent that from happening. So you've got municipalities in the northern part of the state that have those big washouts, building bridges and rebuilding culverts and systems that they know are going to wash out before the life of that engineering system is expired. And it's because that administrative code has not been changed since the 50s. So this is an example of how the political system could address that in order to not only protect Lake Superior from huge runoff situations, but also protect local municipalities from having to reconstruct those same infrastructure projects several times during the time when you should be able to get by with one reconstruction. So it's an environmental issue, but it's also an economic issue, and it's a convenience issue for people all over the state.
An online question, sort of a two-part. Okay, they say, to improve environmental protections, how much can be done by the DNR and how much must be approved by the legislature? Despite the success of regulations, it appears that the Wisconsin legislature is resisting additional environmental regulations. Do you have any suggestions when approaching legislatures for better protection of the environment?
Well, I would say read that Green Fire report to understand what the deficiencies are, how the changes have actually been made, and then do the same thing people did in 1970. When the first Earth Day occurred in 1970, 20 million people showed up at that first Earth Day in a country with a population of 150 million. Every politician took notice. And 2 years later, the Clean Water Act was passed, then the Clean Air Act, then the Safe Drinking Water Act. All kinds of rules and regulations were passed because 20 million people showed up on one day for Earth Day in 1970. And the same could happen today. If people that are elected officials see that the public wants clean water and demands it, the political system might take notice. It's difficult now. It's not the same political system we had 50 years ago, but it still responds, I think, basically to overwhelming public outrage. And I think that's one thing that individuals can do, businesses can do it, local units of government can do it, because we're all affected, not only environmentally, but economically. The Wisconsin DNR rules and regulations are pretty much stuck where they were quite a while ago. Some of them have been diminished. The new ones can't be approved. As Tom said, it takes years to get any changes in administrative codes. The statutory changes aren't happening at all. So we're basically stuck with enforcing what we've got in DNR and trying to use those to take care of the conventional pollutants. The other ones are not being controlled.
Thank you very much for this program. It's bringing back so many memories, goodness gracious. I don't know if you knew Dr. Roy Sutkiss from Tulane University down in Louisiana. So when I was a graduate assistant, I was his field associate doing water quality testing around paper mills throughout the southeastern part of the United States. And so the research that he did actually, just as you described, demonstrated to those paper mills that through, cleaning up their effluent, basically, and capturing a lot of that pulp, that instead of just pushing it right out into the environment, they actually were able to capture that and process that pulp into something that was usable. I don't know exactly what they were doing, what they were using it for, basically. But it just, there's so many still holes in the Clean Water Act, but it still is the premier legislation in
Yeah.
the world for water quality.
Yes.
The non-point source pollution is the largest source of pollution. It's not the point source pollution.
Yep.
The largest sources of pollution are non-point source pollution. That includes myself, because I have a little leaky oil in my car. So I still drive a Subaru Forester that drips oil.
Yep.
I try and capture it as much as possible at home. But it just reminds me, in my throughout my career, it's just, we want to come up with a kind of a technological solution to a lot of things. Yet, in my mind, it's not that complicated. It's
Yeah.
actually simple. It's about input and output, and it's about, nature is designed to be elegant, to recapture all of the waste. There is no waste in nature. It's recaptured through biofeedback mechanisms, it's digested, it's reused, it's reprocessed. We just need to have a different mindset entirely. And as an example, which I use often, no one would want to live in a community of like 10,000 people or more without having a sanitation system, a wastewater treatment facility. But a pig produces as much waste as a human being in a day. And to have a CAFO with 10,000 heads of, pigs, and cows are very similar, and not to have a wastewater treatment facility is a little bit almost ludicrous, basically. But farmers do have very, very, very low margins. And so when I worked with Ducks Unlimited, my role was to do wetlands habitat restoration on private lands, mostly out in Hawaii. But it was always to show the farmers how it would benefit them, and they could actually make money off of this by doing the right thing. And that's what I think we need to focus on. It's not the farmers don't want to do the right thing, but here's the right thing. Show them what the solution can be. Show them how you can bring funding to help them accomplish that, and how they would actually be benefiting the environment and also improving their bottom line. So I loved what you talked about with the Mr. Mead, having that business sense of what is the bottom line. Most people do want to do the right thing. Once you can touch that little button, what is that thing that presses on their heart the hardest? So thank you very much. This was amazing. It just
Right.
reminded me of all those days slogging around in lakes and rivers throughout southeast United States. So I appreciate it.
To your point about recovering things from the paper industry, I just wanted to mention that the waste sulfite liquor that used to go in the river is now being processed by a company on the Wisconsin River that makes 65 products out of that waste sulfite liquor that are sold in the market that used to go in the Wisconsin River and pollute the river. 65 products. And in fact, their biggest problem now is they're not getting enough waste sulfite liquor as an ingredient for their process, because people are reducing the waste and they're changing processes, and their biggest problem is not enough waste liquor to make these products, where in the past they just dumped it in the river. So it's a change in attitude, and it really is for the better. Well, everything under the sun. They're making drilling muds, additives for ice cream, yeast, all kinds of things. Cosmetics, lubricants, oil additives, chemical food, starts for other chemical processes. 65 products out of just waste sulfite liquor from the paper industry. Sorry.
Bob, you spent a lot of time giving examples, 3 major examples in Wisconsin where we have how the Clean Water Act's worked, but at the same time, are we gaining? Okay, I think every one of those industries that you brought up also are very politically connected. Wisconsin Valley Improvement Corporation, the operation of the river.
Yep.
Another question, I'm just giving you an example. The question that someone online asked you, has the fishery recovered? Is there a response? Do we have evidence that the river has recovered with the way the rivers are operated by the power plants and the paper mills. Okay, so I'm not criticizing. We have to be more innovative, is what I'm trying to say. We still have to change our ways. Remember what Leopold, at the beginning of the environmental movement, Leopold said, is it laws that are going to save our resources, or is it ethics? And I think everybody's brought up, I think we have to move towards that and be innovative. And that's why we have environmental education, Bob.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, but meanwhile, all this legislative meandering, and what's happened today is people know how to get around the system, and part of it's money.
Yeah.
Okay, but once you educate them, just like everybody said, that's good. But we have to move towards being more innovative. Just as that last lady said, it's a nutrient game. There's no reason, everything you brought up, even agriculture, no farmer wants nutrients to go down, but the practices that drive the industry, the fertilization and farming the top so we don't have erosion anymore, that's not working. But technology's there, Bob.
Yeah, I agree. And even when technology isn't there, some of these regulations and the problems can be technology forcing. A lot of the controls in the Clean Water Act weren't possible when the act was passed in 1972, but they became possible because whole new industries developed to fill that need to provide that technology. And I think a really good example is all of the proposals that are coming out for climate change now. A lot of industrial changes, a lot of inventions, a lot of new thinking about how to prevent climate change that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't put across the idea that we're facing a major problem in the near future. I think the benefits are obvious. I think the idea is that we can accomplish this sort of thing. There are simple things that agriculture can do. For example, in some parts of the state, there is legacy phosphorus in the soil. There are some parts of the state where you could pull off 20 years worth of crop without putting any phosphorus on. And they're still putting phosphorus on every single year. So, it's not only an economic waste, but it runs off into the nearby flowages and rivers because you have an excess of phosphorus in the soil. The National Science Foundation came up with 13 things that the world could do to prevent climate change. Each of them would generate profit. 13 major things that could be done worldwide that would generate profit, that would reduce the effects of climate change. The implementation hasn't happened yet, but those kinds of things are available if the citizens demand them.
One last question here.
Hi. I really have more of a statement than a question, and it relates to the last statements that were made. And that is that another source of non-point source pollution is heavily logging near lake shores, rivers and streams, shorelines. And for almost 3 years now, I've been working with a forester, putting in a great number of hours, identifying places where that heavy logging near lake shores is taking place. There's a set of standards. They're not regulations, but they're known as best management practices for water quality that the DNR and other entities that do logging are supposed to follow. And we found in our work over 2.5, almost 3 years now, that these mandatory standards are being regularly violated. And we quantified this through extensive surveying and cruising of lake shores. And we've appealed all the way up the DNR ladder and to their auditors and other entities about this. And we keep being rebuffed in various ways. They're mandatory standards, but they find ways not to comply with them. And I think that it takes regulation, it takes laws to stop this kind of thing. There is a committee run by the DNR for best management practices. 80% of the members on that committee come from industry or industry-related areas. And so until that imbalance is changed and a harder look is taken with logging near lake shores and what it's doing, and that is not scientifically measured to any great degree, we're going to see more and more effects from climate change and heavy logging on the water quality on these beloved lakes we have up here.
I think the same could be said for county zoning. There are a series of county zoning disasters that have occurred in the last 15 years, since 2010. They've been drastically reduced in terms of protective measures for development along lake shores. At Oneida County Lakes and Rivers and Vilas County Lakes and Rivers, we've worked on this with county zoning for 2 decades with absolutely no progress. But eventually, people are going to start saying, you know, there's an awful lot of algae in this lake. Where did it come from? I don't see as many fish. There's an awful lot of plants. Can you fix this DNR? Well, you can't on lakes. Once they get over the tipping point, it's not like a river. You can't go back. You can only prevent. With a river, you can take the pollution out and it cleanses itself. With lakes, that doesn't happen. And it's the backbone of the economy in this area. In Oneida County, 75% of the assessed valuation of the county is shoreline. Same is true as Vilas County. And it's not being protected.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks so much to Bob Martini. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to our sponsors, UW Trout Lake Station, Kemp Natural Resources Station, the Lakeland Badger Chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, Oak Fire, and the Minocqua Public Library. And thanks again to the Brittingham Fund, and especially to our hosts here, Oak Fire. And our next speakers, a reminder, will be our own Gretchen Garish and Scott Bovey from the University of Wisconsin Field Stations. So they'll be speaking on UW Up North, what's happening at Kemp Natural Resources Station and Trout Lake Station on February 2nd, 2023. And if you want to sign up for email reminders, we have a sign up in the back of the room. We hope you will do that. And please go to our website, Science on Tap Minocqua, and you can click on Contact Us and add your name. And you can also look for our archived programs, or if you're home for one of our programs, you can watch them live. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next month.